In the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. All praise be to Allah, the Lord of the worlds, and may His peace and blessings be upon His last and final messenger, Muhammad. Alhambra Productions present The Legal Philosophy of Islam by the noble scholar Abdullah bin Bayyah, with simultaneous translation by Hamza Yusuf. These beautiful and illuminating sessions were recorded at the Zaytuna Institute in Hayward, California.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The Shaykh began in the name of Allah and then asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inshallah to benefit us from the knowledge that we learn. And he said he praised Allah for every hal, and he asked Allah forgiveness or protection from the state of the people of the fire. And then he said that it was requested that he speak on the subject of al-Qawa'id al-Fiqhiyya, and so he's going to do that, and he's going to speak on that subject from several points. One of them is what exactly is the Qawa'id al-Fiqhiyya in terms of its definitions, when did it originate, who were the originators of it, what is the meaning of the Qa'id al-Kulliyya, which is universal principles or axioms, and then how do we implement the Qawa'id themselves, these rules or these principles upon which fiqh is based. And he said that what you would learn from Shaykh Khatri, for instance, in the lessons that involve the furu' al-fiqh, which are the branches of fiqh, because fiqh has usul and it has furu'. The branches of fiqh are those things that we learn, like bab al-wudu and these things. So the Shaykh said that what the qawa'id are is they are the axioms or the principles that the fuqaha base the furu' upon. In other words, how they derive the furu', it is the implementation of these principles that we arrive at the furu' themselves, the branches of fiqh. And then he said that he wants to look at also how does a person interact with these axioms. In other words, how does he use the axioms to implement them in his everyday life in relation to his fiqh. And then he also began by saying that we want to look first and foremost at the actual meaning of qa'ida. And he said in the Arabic language, qa'ida has more than one meaning, but primarily it means the foundation. The qa'ida is the foundation, it's the asas. And the qa'ida is, it's mentioned in the Quran that Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he built the Kaaba, he laid down the foundation. The qawa'id al-bayt are the foundations of the house. So the Quran used it with its literal meaning. That's a literal meaning. So the literal meaning is actually the foundation of something upon which something is built. And it's also mentioned in the Quran about the house whose foundations it's metaphorically used for people who get a punishment upon them, like the foundations of their house collapse from under them and can no longer support them. And then he said it's also used by the Arabs to be a metaphorical term. So for instance, he said the Arabs will say he did not base his knowledge or his understanding on a qa'idah. In other words, on something firm or a solid foundation. And here it means an intellectual foundation and not a physical foundation. And then he said, and this is what's known in balagha as isti'ara. It's a metaphorical use, rhetorically, it's a metaphorical use of the word qa'ida. And then he said that the qa'ida itself is from what we call the kulliyat. And you have juz'iyat and you have kulliyat in logic. And the kulliyat are universals. The juz'iyat are particulars. And so he said the qawa'id are dealing with universals, not with particulars. So when we speak about qawa'id, we're speaking about universals and not particulars in our understanding.
القواعد.
So the Shaykh said that, again, this section that we're dealing with is a section that is a universal section that is made up of particulars. So the particulars are contained in the universal. And he said that this is a science that comes from the later sciences. In other words, it was developed later. It's not from the earlier sciences. And he said, as he mentioned, the first trip that he came here when he had his class on Usul al-Fiqh, which is related to this science, but they're different sciences. He mentioned that there were three periods or three progressive generations, each one adding a new dimension to Islamic scholarship. He said that the first group are known as al-Jil al-Sam'i, and this is the generation of those who listened. It is the period of listening. And this is basically is considered in the first 100 years. These are people who heard directly from the Prophet ﷺ, and also who heard from the companions, who had brilliant memories and who were retaining what they were hearing. And many of the Sahaba, as you know, were unlettered people, but they had phenomenal memories and they could memorize what they'd heard. And so this first period is the period known as Jil al-Sam'i. The only thing that they did record during this time was the Quran. Even though there were some few of the people that were actually writing down hadiths, they weren't recorded in the way that they would be later. The Quran itself was actually recorded completely. It was an effort done primarily by Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu. It begins with Abu Bakr, the collection of the Quran, and then with Uthman, Sayyidina Uthman. And then he said that the next group after this group, Jil al-Sam'i, these are called Jil al-Jam'i. And this is the period where they begin to collect what was heard. And this period begins in essence with the Khilafah of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz radiallahu anhu, who asked, or rather commanded, as Amir al-Mu'mineen, he commanded Shihab al-Zuhri, who was one of the great tabi'een, a scholar in Medina, and he was a narrator. He told him to begin to collect the hadiths in writing them down in a formal, in other words, to codify them, to make them a compendium of hadiths, so that this science would not be lost, because times were changing and they recognized the need for this. And so this begins to happen. Now, Malik ibn Anas radiallahu anhu was a student of Imam Zuhri, and Imam Malik radiallahu anhu writes his Muwatta in Medina. And Malik is born in 91 and lives a long life. So he writes the Muwatta in Medina, and this Muwatta is narrated to a lot of people. And he said there were actually over 50 Muwattas. So the Muwatta'at were many, because different great scholars that heard from Imam Malik the Muwatta, and Imam Malik was, over the period of his life, he was refining it and changing hadiths, and because he himself was perfecting his book. And so you had several people that actually took the book from him, among which were Muhammad al-Shaybani, who was the famous Hanafi scholar. He took the book and he relates a Muwatta from Imam Malik that differs in some ways from the most famous of all the Muwattas, which is known as the Muwatta of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, who came from Andalusia and heard the Muwatta from Imam Malik radiallahu anhu. And his Muwatta is the one that had the largest spread throughout the Muslim world. And so there were many Muwattas. This was also the time in which Ahmad ibn Hanbal wrote the Musnad, the Imam Muslim, al-Bukhari. All of this is that period of gathering these hadiths and making the compendiums. But he said at the end of the 2nd century, a man arose, a scholar named Imam al-Shafi'i radiallahu anhu, and he writes a book known as the Risala. And in this book, he begins to codify the actual usul. In other words, the ways in which rulings are derived. Because what he realized is that we have this massive amount of information. There's all of these hadiths that have been collected, but how do we understand the hadiths? In other words, how do we apply this information to everyday life, recognizing that, for instance, the Arabic language has a role in this, and even by the time of Imam Shafi'i, the Arabic language is already diminishing in the Arabian Peninsula. So the language is beginning to change. So what he wanted to do was set down clear guidelines by which scholars could understand how the hadiths are used. So the Shaykh said that the next stage after this is known as Jil al-Fiqhi, and this begins with Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu, who dies in 204. And he said that this is the end, this period is the period in which Usul al-Fiqh is being developed. And then the next, the development of what is known as al-Qawa'id al-Fiqhiyya does not occur until the end of the 3rd century. And he said that there's a story about how it began, how this science began. And he said some of the later ulama have raised some doubts about the authenticity of this story, and there are some who actually reject it. The Shaykh said he personally doesn't really see a reason why to reject it, and he went into that later, so I'll do that. But he said the story goes, and it's mentioned by Imam Suyuti in Ashbah wa Nadha'ir, which is a book in this science, and other of the ulama mentioned this, that a man named Abu Tahir Dabbas, who was a Hanafi scholar living in what they used to call Mesopotamia, the place behind the river, Balad Wara al-Nahar, which is now known as Iraq. And this Shaykh, there was a rumor that he had developed 16 rules, which the fiqh, the furu' were based on. These 16 rules that could be learned in order to derive rulings from. Now, there was a student at that time, Shaykh al-Harawi, who had heard this, and he wanted to meet this, to listen to the Shaykh, and it was said that the Shaykh kept this to himself. So he went to the masjid where the Shaykh was an imam, and this Shaykh was also blind. And he waited till everybody left, and he hid in some of the, there was some matting in there, and he hid behind this and waited until the Shaykh closed the masjid. And then the Shaykh, it was his habit to recite these 16 qawa'id, the qa'idah, to himself near the mihrab. And so he was reciting, and he got to the 5th qa'idah, and the student began to cough. He actually was overcome by coughing, and the Shaykh stopped, knew somebody was there, found him, got hold of him and started beating him, and then kicked him out of the masjid. And after that, he never recited them in the masjid. Now, the Shaykh said people might think that this is strange. Why would he be withholding his knowledge like that and not letting the people know what it is? But the Shaykh said that the truth is that this was a new knowledge. And the Shaykh himself could have been worried that he did not want this knowledge to get out, because he still might have been thinking, is this really sound what I have brought? Because everybody knows it's very dangerous to innovate in the religion. So from the man's own fear of Allah, he could have not seen himself as somebody worthy of putting forth this new knowledge and been frightened of that. And so that might have been a concern. In fact, he said the reason that he might have been reciting it every night is that he was actually thinking about them. And so he was reciting them and thinking whether or not these were really sound principles that were worth taking them out. But these 5, the student heard the first 5 and he memorized them. And so he went out and he began to tell people about these, and these 5 caught on. And then from that, this knowledge began to develop, and there were other scholars that began to develop this knowledge amongst the ulama. And he said that Imam al-Karhi was one of them who developed this, and Qadi Hussein and others from the Hanafi. And he said also the Shafi'i scholars began to develop this science as well. And then he said that the Maliki scholars and the Hanabila, he caught up later. They initially did not catch on to this science, but they later on began to add their own additions to the science and their own in relation to their schools of thought. And so he said that the later scholars of the Maliki school wrote important works in this science, and also the Hanbali school like Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, rahimahullah, who wrote an important and famous work in this science. And so this is basically how this science began. And he said, even though the story is called by some an apocryphal story, a story that really is probably more mythological than it is real, but he said that he doesn't feel that that's justifiable to say that it's a myth. He thinks it's quite a plausible story. So the Shaykh said then that this division, this tripart division of looking at this triad of generations, the generation of hearing, the generation of Kiling, and the generation of understanding, was certain pious, meaning they didn't understand before, actually writing down, and how, meaning that they didn't understand it before, but actually writing down and how it's derived and how we understand. That it's important. And others and he said and others have mentioned, he said that he feels that it's a useful way of looking at this. And then he said that the qawa'id, and then he said that the qawa'id al-fiqhiyya, which comes later in the 3rd and 4th century, is also something that's important. It's important in this overall development of the Islamic legislative process. He said that the qawa'id al-fiqhiyya, in looking at this and how it differs from al-qawa'id al-usuliyya, because there is a difference. There's a relationship, but there's also important distinctions between the two. But he said, generally, if you look at the qa'idah, what a qa'idah is in relation to this technical term, he said a qa'idah is basically a comprehensive or aphoristic statement that is made up or composed of a small number of words, but within those words is contained many, many meanings. So in a sense, it's a legislative matrix. It's a legal principle upon which many laws are based. So this is the understanding. And what this enabled students who would learn these and memorize these things, it enabled them, in a sense, instead of having to memorize all of the various specific rulings of everything, which is obviously very difficult, if these rules were learned and understood properly and examples were given and how they were used, then a student could indeed begin to learn how to analogically use these as ways of deriving rulings. And he said one of the things about the Arabic language, and this is a miracle of the Quran, because the Qawa'id is mentioned in the Quran, that the Quran is a language which is based on using the least amount of words to convey the largest amount of meanings. So in rhetoric, there's an ijaz, and ijaz is using something that has many meanings, and it's a small amount. And so kalam mujiz is something that is a summation. It's a summation of many, many things. It's the epitome. And so he said that you have ijaz al-qasr in the Arabic rhetoric, and you also have ijaz al-hadf. So one is where one word is used to mean a lot of different things. Another is where it's an elliptical type of statement where something is left out, but it's implied or it's understood. And this is the way in which the Arabs convey their meanings. So he used the example, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. He said when Allah says يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ, He's using one word, adl, but within that word, how many meanings are understood? Because there's the adl of a government. There's the adl of the family. The father has to be just between his children. There's the adl of a citizen in his society, that he doesn't oppress others. So there, even though the word is only one word, you have all of these meanings that are contained in that. So it's comprehensive. It's a summation of these meanings. And he said, and so this is, in a sense, what the qa'idah is. It's something that is mujaz, it's a summation, it's comprehensive. And he said, even though this is something that developed from our ulama, the reality of this is that the qawa'id come really from the hadith. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ is, in essence, the one who established the foundation of this science. And he said, you can see clearly, for instance, in the hadith, لا ضرر ولا ضرار, which is a sound hadith in which the Prophet said, there is no harm and there is no reciprocation of harm. So you cannot harm others, and if they harm you, it doesn't justify you going and harming them. So this in itself is a qa'idah. It's very small. It's only two words basically. And yet within that short summation is contained all of these different meanings. The hadith is related by Imam Malik radiallahu anhu. So the Prophet ﷺ, in these comprehensive words that he used, the Prophet ﷺ was in a sense giving us these qawa'id. So the qawa'id, the ulama of this science derive, many of their qawa'id come directly from the hadith or are derived from meanings that are contained within hadith. So the Shaykh said that the foundations of this is from the hadith and also from the words of the ulama. Now he wants to look at the difference between what is known as al-qawa'id al-usuliyya and al-qawa'id al-fiqhiyya. The qawa'id al-usuliyya, the usul is the methodology by which the rulings are derived. And this is known as usul al-fiqh, whereas these are the qawa'id of the fiqh. And he said that there's a difference between the two principles. And he said the difference is in the relation of, he said that the qawa'id al-usuliyya are qawa'id that that precede the ruling or the hukm. In other words, the hukm follows the foundation or the root, whereas in the qawa'id al-fiqhiyya, they do not precede, they actually follow the rulings. So the difference is a prefix and a suffix. The qawa'id al-usuliyya are the prefix of the rulings, and the qawa'id al-fiqhiyya are the suffixes of the rulings. In other words, they follow them. So the example that the Shaykh gave is, for instance, in usul, you have a principle, a qa'idah, al-amru yadullu ala al-wujub, which means a command indicates that something's an obligation. This is a basic foundational point of our usuli scholars. So in the Quran, for instance, how do we know that prayer is a fard? How do we know that prayer is fard? We know that because we know that in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the imperative in the Arabic when He says, aqimu salah. So it's a command from Allah, is an imperative where Allah is saying, establish prayer. And because you know in your usul, there's a qa'idah, which is that an obligation is the command mode in Arabic indicates an obligation. So the ruling for prayer, based on that asl, that foundation, is that prayer is therefore wajib. So syllogistically, you would say that commands indicate that that something is an obligation. The prayer is used in the Quran with the imperative form. Therefore, the prayer is an obligation. This is how the usuli is thinking. Now he said that the qawa'id al-fiqhiyya come after the rulings. In other words, once all the rulings, they would ask Imam Shafi'i, if a man doubts in his wudu, is his wudu broken by that? And he said, if he had certainty that he had made the wudu and he's in the prayer, then he continues to pray. And then there were other rulings like that. The ulama derived from looking at all these rulings, al-yaqeen la yazuru bi-shakk, that certainty does not, you don't lose certainty because of doubt. In other words, if doubt follows your basic certainty, then you maintain the origin. So for instance, another ruling, they would ask, for instance, one of the imams, if a man doubts whether he prays 3 or 4 prayers, what does he do? 3 or 4 rakats. He said he should begin on what he's certain of and then finish it there. So if you're certain you played 3 and you're doubting about the 4th one, then you go to that, the yaqeen. and the yaqeen is not removed by doubt. So he said, this is how then something precedes another. In other words, the usul al-fiqh is the rulings come secondary to the primary asl. Whereas in the qawa'id, it is the qawa'id that are secondary to the primary rulings of the branches of fiqh. And this is the basic. So the Shaykh said the second, so that's the first difference. The second difference is that the qa'idah, in other words, the qawa'id al-fiqhiyya, are derived without any mediation. In other words, there's no wasita, there's no mediation between the qa'idah and the ruling. So what you derive is not mediated by a specific text. And he said that the texts are, there's texts that are related to tafsil, and then there's texts, in other words, that are particulars, and then there's texts that are general. And so he said, for instance, with the qa'idah, you would say if a man doubts whether he divorced his wife or not, the qa'idah is that if the certainty is not removed by doubt. So if he's certain he's married to her, and then he doubts that he's divorced to her, he is still considered married to her. And so there wasn't any means by which that ruling was arrived at. In other words, the ruling itself is firm. Whereas with the qa'idah al-usuliyya, if you say, for instance, he's doubting whether or not the zakat is an obligation or not, he says you have to have the nas, or the text. In other words, it needs textual proof for it. And the textual proof is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Atu zakah. So there's the imperative which is there. But the imperative is based on a ruling. And the ruling is that the Quran is commanding us to pay our zakat. So the difference here is one of them has a means, and the other one does not. And the means of the qa'idah al-usuliyya is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said in the Quran that zakat is an obligation, and so that is mentioned with the ruling. Whereas in the qa'idah fiqhiyya, that is not mentioned. You don't have that means by which you jump to the understanding. So the Shaykh said that these qawa'id have exceptions, and the exceptions do not necessarily break the rule. So what he said, in fact, he was saying that some of the ulama said that the exception does, and he said there was a debate on this. Imam al-Qarafi radiallahu anhu wrote an entire book only on the istithna'at. The kitab al-istithna just deals with the exceptions that are used in these qawa'id. And so he said that the qa'idah, he said, Imam al-Maqari says it's akthariya. In other words, the majority of the time, the qa'idah, or this principle or axiom, stands. But, and others call it the aghlabiyya, al-qa'idah al-aghlabiyya, in other words, that it is the dominant principle. But there are times when the principle is not applicable. And he said, for instance, if you look at the principle, al-yaqeen la yazuru bi-shak, that certainty is not diminished or removed by doubt. What the Shaykh said is that's a qa'idah everybody agrees on, all of the imams. And he said, but, for instance, Imam Malik radiallahu anhu and Imam al-Hasan radiallahu anhu did not apply that qa'idah to wudu. Whereas the other three imams, out of the four imams, did. They said that if you doubt your wudu, and you had certain that you did wudu, that you haven't lost your wudu, you don't need to redo your wudu. Imam Malik radiallahu anhu, Imam al-Hasan did not. They did not apply that qa'idah to, so this is what's known as an istithna. It's mustathna min al-qa'idah. It's something that's, it's an exception from the principle. So in wudu, for the Malikis, if they have doubt about the wudu, then they need to renew their wudu. But this istithna, he said that it confirms the basic qa'idah. In other words, the fact that there's only few exceptions of this, but generally the rule is applicable, that we have the applicability of the ruling. So the Shaykh said that now what we'll look at is what are these 5 foundational principles that all of fiqh is based on, even though he said, some of the ulama said that it's stretching it or going a little bit too far to say all of fiqh is based on these 5, because in order to do that, one would have to have some gross exaggerations or interpretations in attempting to apply every fiqh ruling back to one of these 5, and this is a debate. But he said basically the foundation of the fiqh is based on these 5 principles. One of them is ad-darar yuzal, which means that harm should be removed. This is a qaida, a principle in fiqh, that harm should be removed. Whenever you have harm, it's necessary to remove that harm. Another one is that al-yaqinu la yazuru bi-shak, that certainty is not removed by doubt. The foundation, if you have certainty and that was the origin, then you don't let doubt come in, like obsessive compulsive thoughts, something like that, people that doubt all the time. So that's another ruling. And then also al-umur bi-maqasidiha, al-umur bil-maqasid, that matters are based on the aims and purposes of those things. In other words, you look to the aims and purposes to understand what you're dealing with. So the affair or the matter is based on what you want out of it. What is your intention? What is the aim or the purpose of that? And then also al-mashaqqatu tajlib at-taysir, which means that difficulty, when there are difficult situations, there's dire circumstances, that dire circumstances necessitate facilitation or dispensations. In other words, you have to make things easy for people when they're in constricted circumstances. And this principle is applicable to many, many circumstances. And then also al-'ada or al-'urf, al-'ada muhakkama, that the custom of a people is something that is legislatively applied or taken into consideration. So the custom of a people is something that the Sharia applies. Like, for instance, in divorce and things. He's going to give examples of all of these. But the Shaykh said that we're going to look at these qawa'id al-khams, these 5 principles in detail. The Shaykh is going to do this. And he said, and if he has time during these days, if he can get through these, because really we've got an ocean of knowledge. As you can see, the Shaykh he's an ocean. So we're going to be swimming. And I'm already starting to drown. So I know you guys must be, but alhamdulillah. أنا قطر الآن نعوم في بحر وأنا أحس أني غارق فسامحوني. So the Shaykh said if once he gets through these, inshallah, that he'll look at other qawaid, because there are several qawaid that are worth looking at, inshallah.